started. So welcome everyone to the very last slot of talks on Math, Stats, and Computer Science Capstone Day. And I can't think of a better way to end the day than to introduce Jeremy Krovitz, who is going to tell you about a project called Assignment Planning for the Visual Learner, and this was from his Internet Computing course.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Before I begin, I want to thank all of you for being here. Your support means a lot. I want to thank the people I worked with, Luke Brown, Ray Hushin, and Rose Havner. I also want to thank my capstone coach, Libby Shoup, for her guidance in preparing for today, and the entire mathematics, statistics, and computer science department as a whole. Now let's move on to talking about assignment planning for the visual learner. So I will begin my presentation by discussing my motivation for doing this particular project, which came from my desire to visualize assignments from start to finish over different periods of time. I will then talk about the website that I created to do that, and I will demonstrate how the website works. I will then discuss the tools that I used, like Python, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, the challenges I encountered while doing the project, as well as the lessons learned. One primary one being, don't bite off more than you can chew. When I took internet computing last semester, I was assigned a largely open-ended month-and-a-half final project, where the only requirements were to work with a group and to design and develop a dynamic website or web application that must use AJAX, asynchronous, JavaScript, and XML. I knew I wanted the project to involve data visualization in some aspects. When my group member Ray suggested that we develop a timeline visualization app, I became excited about the idea because I use an electronic calendar to plan out all of my school assignments, specifically Google Calendar. I wanted my website to be different from Google Calendar though, because Google Calendar doesn't allow one to view one's assignments across several months, choose a start date, or filter assignments by category. I wanted my project to have this functionality. The website was designed so that each user will be able to create an account. Each user will have a timeline. Each user will have a timeline as represented in this mock-up sketch of my website. A user should be able to create categories, assignments, and be able to designate assignments as part of a particular category. The user should then be able to set the start date on the calendar and view their assignments starting from whatever date they set, as well as be able to switch between short and long-term views. The user should also be able to fill in milestones of an assignment. Okay, I know I just threw a lot of information at you all at once. Let me do a live demo so you get a better understanding of what the site can do. So here are several assignments from one of the classes that I'm taking right now called Introduction to GIS. So as you can see, I have my GIS final project, the study guide to study for exam number 2, and data organization, as well as some other assignments. Well, had I been able to implement milestones at this point, I would have been able to put in the GIS paper and the data collection or organization is part of milestones on the timeline that I could fill in. However, we didn't have time to implement this yet. Also, also, I'd like to, we didn't have a chance to implement subcategories, which we had initially planned, and this would have been helpful because I could say, for example, a subcategory could be GIS exams or GIS labs. And that would just allow one to more easily see the events. But I would like to do this in the future. Now, you can also switch to the long-term view to see assignments over several months. And also, with this tool, I'm able to create a new category, and I will demo this. So, one of my classes is called Collective Intelligence, and right now I have the project, the proposal for my final project coming up. I know it's really that final project time, isn't it? It's really coming up. So I'll call this, I'll just actually say final project proposal. And because there's not yet, you don't yet have a color picker, unfortunately, but I do happen to know off the top of my head the hex code for Macalester Gold, which is FFB 500. So I'll do that. And as you can see, there it is. Oh, wait a minute. This is not supposed to be there. This is actually just supposed to be collective intelligence, because this is a category. But I can just change this. I can edit it, resubmit it, and there it is. So now I'll create a new task. Now, here I can do the final project proposal. Collective intelligence, that's the right category now. And then I can set, let's say I want it to start it tomorrow, Saturday. So I'll choose the date to be 3/30/2019, and then I'll choose the end date to be Sunday, so March 31st. And as you can see, the project appears without having to refresh the page. I can also switch to the long-term view again, and there it is. So now that I have done the live demo, I'm going to go back to my presentation and show some of the, or talk about some of the tools that I use to do my project. As you can see from my demo, my group did not accomplish all that we had hoped to. Utilizing various tools within Python, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and figuring out how to make 4 programming languages and their tools interact with one another was a significant factor that resulted in the difference between getting done what was planned versus what was actually completed. I used a framework called Flask to handle the server-side processing. Through Flask, I was able to do the formatting of my website using HTML. The Flask framework looks for HTML files in a folder called templates, and it also you can also use Flask for to call CSS and JavaScript files. So CSS for the styling and JavaScript for the behavior, and those are found in a folder called static. As you can see, this is the entire Flask, this is the entire structure of the entire file structure of my project. It's quite complex, handling the different interactions between the different files, and that's another one of the factors that contributed to a lot more, to not getting as much done as we had hoped. I use Flask SQL Alchemy, a Flask extension that adds for support for SQL Alchemy, an open source SQL toolkit and object relational mapper for the Python programming language. I use Flask SQL Alchemy to create a database. My database contains several models, and the relationships between the models are depicted in this logical data structure that I created also known by the acronym LDS. The boxes in yellow represent the models that have actually been implemented correctly and are currently storing data. The boxes that are grayed out depict 2 models representing milestones and subcategories which have not yet been written and implemented into the database. The LDS is showing, so essentially the main detail, some details aren't as important, but the gist of this is that one user has multiple categories, and one category has many assignments. So this is just representing the way that things are stored in the database. It's also showing that an assignment can only have one category, and a category can only have one user, as well as a category. So for the ones that are grayed out, a category can have several subcategories, and a subcategory can have multiple assignments, and also an assignment can have multiple milestones. So having to write a database and figuring out, well, in SQL Alchemy, and then figuring out how to integrate it with the other parts of the code to make the software work was a task that also contributed to the project taking longer than expected. For the project, I was required to use AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML in the code, in some manner. My group's goal for our AJAX call was to make the task appear when the form was submitted without having to refresh the page. We did not quite achieve this goal last semester. I worked on this during winter break and got the task to appear on the page without having to refresh it. What my group was able to accomplish, though, was making a successful AJAX call. AJAX calls are used both to send data to the server, as well as requesting and receiving data from the server. When exchanging data between a browser and a server, the data can only be text. JSON is text, and we can convert JavaScript objects into JSON and then into Python, a process known as deserialization. We can also convert any JSON that's received from Python, and we can turn that back into JavaScript to be output to the screen, a process known as serialization. AJAX calls were tricky to implement because we had to figure out how to deserialize the data so that the input from the form would be in a syntax that the SQL Alchemy database can interpret. Furthermore, we had to figure out how to serialize the data from the database so it would be output to the screen. In this image, the form inputs are being sent to the database for them to be stored there. For our site, AJAX calls allow us to send the form inputs to the database so it can be stored when the form is submitted. It also allows us to retrieve data from the database. So as you can see, the 2 categories, Introduction to GIS and Collective Intelligence that I showed in the demo, those are output back to the screen from being pulled out of the database. So when my group presented our project in class at the end of last semester, I recall we had some issues with the way dates were displayed on the timeline view and placing the timeline lines at the correct locations. I recall one of my group members, when we were organizing the presentation, I was the one who was gonna do the demo of the project. And I remember Rose said to me, show the long-term view and then never show it again. Because we were kind of worried that it wasn't quite functional at that point, since there were quite a few issues with the date objects. So one issue was that JavaScript date objects are very difficult to work with for several reasons. The resulting date is relative to the time zone setting on your computer. And so this means that 2 different computers might output a different value for the same date object. And additionally, trying to compare two dates will return the number of milliseconds, and then it would require like all of these conversions, which seems like a lot of work just to get to the right format. Well, so during winter break, I did some searching and found out about a wonderful JavaScript library called Moment.js, which solved all of my date problems. Moment.js allows one to integrate date operations in JavaScript very easily. Look at this snippet of code. It is a moment object. It's taking in the date, today's date actually, March 29th, 2019, and it's just saying add a year. And then it outputs it in the exact same format it was input in. To me, this solved so many problems, and it was quite easy actually to get then the dates working correctly. Now everything shows up on the timeline as it's supposed to. Well, in terms of the dates, everything does, which is great. So during the course of this assignment, I learned some very important lessons. The primary one being, don't bite off more than you can chew. What I mean by this is that the goals for our project were overly ambitious. We were initially going to use Google Calendar, which did not end up happening due to the extent of the project, which we did not exactly realize when we were planning the project at the beginning. It is important to realize that when planning a project, to consider what you think will be realistic and what will not be realistic to accomplish within the timeline given. I was the group member actually at the beginning who was concerned that integrating Google Calendar within a month and a half to be able to import assignments